Jack had always enjoyed the quiet solitude of his cabin in the mountains. Far away from the chaos of city life, his mornings were marked by the peaceful hum of the forest. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. It wasn't the usual sounds of birds chirping or the wind rustling through the trees. This was something off. He was halfway through his morning coffee when the low, guttural sound reached his ears. At first, he dismissed it as the distant growl of a storm approaching. But as the noise persisted, a deep unease settled in his chest. Setting his cup down, Jack grabbed his coat and stepped outside, eyes scanning the tree line just beyond the clearing. There it was again, a deep, throaty growl that sent a chill down his spine. As Jack moved cautiously toward the sound, his instincts told him to turn back, lock the door, and stay inside. But his curiosity had always been stronger than his fear, and something about this noise felt different, urgent, almost pleading. He had lived in the mountains long enough to recognize the calls of most animals, but this was unusual. Suddenly, through the dense mist that had begun to settle in the early morning, a figure emerged at the edge of the clearing. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a bear, a massive creature, its fur dark and matted, lumbered toward him. But this bear wasn't like the ones Jack had encountered during his years in the wilderness. It wasn't aggressive, nor did it seem interested in defending territory or hunting for food. In fact, the bear's movements were slow and labored, its head low, as though it was weighed down by something far heavier than its own body. Jack's heart raced. Every survival instinct he had honed told him to back away. Bears, after all, weren't creatures to be trifled with. But then, something unexpected happened. The bear stopped a few yards away and looked straight at him. Not with the wild, unpredictable eyes of a predator, but with something else, something Jack couldn't quite place. Desperation? Pain? The bear let out another deep growl, but this time it wasn't threatening. If Jack didn't know better, he would have sworn the animal was asking for help. "What in the world?" Jack whispered under his breath, taking a hesitant step backward. The bear responded by pawing at the ground, its massive claws digging into the earth as though trying to communicate something. Jack's breath quickened. His mind raced with possibilities, but none made sense. Why would a wild bear approach him like this? And why wasn't it attacking? The bear growled again, louder this time, and then, astonishingly, it turned its massive body and began to lumber back toward the tree line. After a few steps, it stopped, looking back at Jack, almost as if it was waiting for him. Jack's instincts screamed at him to retreat, to head back to the safety of his cabin. But something about the bear's behavior gnawed at him. It wasn't a threat. In fact, it seemed as though the bear was guiding him. His pulse quickened, but against his better judgment, Jack took a step forward, then another. Before he knew it, he was following the bear into the thick forest, his mind spinning with questions. What could possibly be going on? Why was a bear, of all creatures, beckoning him into the woods? The cold morning air bit at his skin, but Jack hardly noticed. His senses were on high alert, his eyes focused on the large, dark figure moving steadily ahead of him. Branches snapped underfoot, and the eerie silence of the forest enveloped them both as they moved deeper into the woods. They walked for what felt like hours, the towering trees around them growing denser and the light dimming as the morning fog thickened. Jack's thoughts raced. Every rational part of him wanted to turn around, to go back to his cabin, but the bear's behavior was so strange, so purposeful. Finally, the bear came to a halt. Jack stopped a few paces behind, his breath visible in the cold air as he stood motionless, waiting. The bear looked back at him once more, its deep eyes reflecting something Jack couldn't quite define. Then it let out a low guttural sound, pawing at the ground again, this time with more urgency. Jack's pulse quickened. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Whatever the bear was trying to show him, he was about to find out. Jack stood frozen in place, his breath coming out in shallow puffs of cold air as he stared at the bear. The creature's massive paw scratched the ground again, its dark eyes locked onto his. For a moment, Jack thought about turning around, heading back to the warmth of his cabin and pretending none of this had happened. Who in their right mind would follow a bear deeper into the forest? But something tugged at him, deep in his gut. This wasn't normal bear behavior. There was a reason the animal was acting like this, almost like it was pleading for him to understand. But what could possibly drive a wild creature to seek help from a human? His mind raced through possibilities. Was the bear injured? Was it trying to lead him to something? Someone? The logical side of his brain screamed for him to turn back, to get away from the danger that could so easily arise from this situation. But another part of him, the part that had always been curious, the part that had spent years in these woods, couldn't ignore the mystery unfolding before him. He took a deep breath, his decision weighing heavily on his shoulders. Jack knew that following a wild animal, especially one as unpredictable as a bear, could end badly. But if there was even the slightest chance that the bear was trying to show him something important, could he really walk away? The bear gave a low grunt, turning its massive head toward the forest ahead. It began to move again slowly, as if giving Jack time to decide. Every few steps it looked back, checking to see if Jack would follow. Jack hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the distant outline of his cabin through the trees. Safety was just a short walk away. He could go back, pretend this never happened, and continue his quiet life. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. With a final exhale, Jack made his decision. He took a step forward, then another, until he was once again following the bear into the dense forest. The undergrowth was thick, the ground uneven beneath his boots, but Jack kept his eyes trained on the animal ahead of him. Each step felt like a step further into something he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the woods, the towering trees above casting long shadows on the forest floor. Jack felt the familiar weight of his old hunting knife at his belt, the only source of comfort in a situation that made little sense. He could still turn back, still choose the safer option. But now, the curiosity gnawing at him was too strong to ignore. After what felt like an eternity, the bear stopped again. Jack slowed to a halt, his breath catching in his throat as he tried to make sense of their surroundings. They were in a part of the forest Jack didn't recognize, an area he'd never ventured into during his years of living there. The trees were denser, the ground littered with fallen branches and undergrowth, so thick that it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The bear looked back at him, its deep eyes filled with something that almost resembled relief. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. What had the bear brought him to? His eyes scanned the area, but nothing seemed out of place. There was no obvious danger, no signs of a struggle. Just the quiet hum of the forest, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the steady sound of the bear's heavy breathing. "All right, what is it?" Jack murmured under his breath, half to himself, half to the bear. "What are you trying to show me?" The bear growled softly in response, its massive paw once again scraping the ground. Jack's brow furrowed as he moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt down where the bear had been scratching and cleared away some of the leaves and dirt, his hands trembling slightly as he unearthed something buried beneath the surface. At first, Jack thought it was a stone, just another piece of debris in the forest floor. But as he brushed more dirt away, he realized it was something else entirely. His fingers touched cold metal, rusted and weathered from time. It wasn't just any piece of metal. It was a trap, a bear trap. Jack's pulse quickened as he uncovered more of the rusted metal jaws, their teeth sharp and deadly, even after years of being buried. His stomach churned at the thought of what the trap was meant to do: maim, cripple, or kill any animal unfortunate enough to step on it. The bear let out a soft growl, its eyes never leaving the trap. Jack's mind raced. Had the bear been caught in one of these before? Was it trying to show him the dangers hidden throughout the forest? Or worse, was this part of a larger problem, something darker than he'd anticipated? He stood up slowly, his eyes still on the trap. There had to be more. If one was here, there could be others, scattered throughout the woods, waiting to catch unsuspecting animals. But why were they here? Who had set them? And what else was lurking in this part of the forest? The bear let out another low growl, pulling Jack from his thoughts. It started moving again, deeper into the woods, its massive body disappearing into the shadows between the trees. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced down at the trap one last time before following the bear. Whatever this was, it was far from over. The forest grew thicker, the air colder as Jack followed the bear deeper into the unknown. The undergrowth tugged at his boots, and the towering trees seemed to lean in closer, as if they were silently watching him, waiting for what would happen next. His mind buzzed with questions, but none of them had clear answers. Jack's thoughts kept circling back to the rusted bear trap he had uncovered. It was old, buried deep in the forest, but its presence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Traps like that weren't just casually left behind, they were set with purpose. And if one trap had been there, who knew how many more were scattered through these woods, waiting to ensnare any animal that crossed their path. The bear, lumbering ahead of him, continued its steady pace, pausing every now and then to look back and make sure Jack was following. The creature's eyes still held that same strange desperation, as though it knew more than it could communicate, as though it understood the danger they were walking toward. Jack had always considered himself a practical man. He lived by instinct, relied on logic, and rarely let emotions cloud his judgment. But right now, none of his instincts could explain why he was trusting this bear, why he was following it into the heart of the forest instead of turning back. Yet he pressed on. The forest began to change. The trees thinned slightly, and Jack noticed something odd. Broken branches, disturbed patches of dirt, and strange markings on the ground. It was subtle, but it was there, signs that something, or someone, had been through this area recently. His pulse quickened as he scanned his surroundings. It wasn't just the traps, there was more to this. Suddenly, the bear stopped again. Jack, lost in thought, nearly walked right into it. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, as the bear turned its massive head to the left, letting out a low, rumbling growl. Jack followed the bear's gaze, squinting to make out what had caught its attention. Then he saw it. Through the trees, hidden just beyond the thick brush, was a structure. It was almost entirely camouflaged by the dense foliage, and if not for the bear's keen senses, Jack might have missed it. It looked like a cabin, but not one that had been built for living. This place was rough, hastily constructed, and poorly maintained. The wooden walls were weathered, the windows grimy and cracked. But what stood out the most was the silence surrounding it. There was something eerie about the way the building sat there, as if it didn't belong. Jack crouched low, his heart pounding. What was this place? Who had built it? And why did the bear seem to know exactly where it was? He moved slowly through the brush, keeping his steps light and quiet. The bear followed behind him, its usual heavy footsteps now oddly silent, as if it understood the need for caution. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he approached the structure. There were no signs of life, no lights, no movement, but that didn't mean it was abandoned. The closer he got, the more his unease grew. Something about this place felt wrong. It wasn't just a hunting cabin, and it wasn't a shelter for hikers. There was something darker lurking behind those walls, something that had driven the bear to bring him here. As Jack crept closer, he spotted something glinting in the dirt near the entrance. He knelt down and brushed aside the leaves, revealing a series of steel traps, carefully laid out and ready to spring. His stomach churned. These traps weren't just old relics left behind. They were active, placed there recently by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. The bear let out another growl, this one softer, more urgent. Jack stood up, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the cabin. It didn't make sense. Why would someone set so many traps around a place like this? What were they trying to catch? Or worse, what were they trying to keep out? Jack's thoughts raced as he tried to piece it all together. The traps, the strange behavior of the bear, the hidden structure in the middle of the forest. It all pointed to something much larger than a few rogue hunters. He circled the cabin slowly, making sure to stay out of sight. As he rounded the corner, his eyes caught something that made his blood run cold. Behind the cabin, half concealed by branches and debris, was a pile of animal carcasses. Bears, deer, smaller wildlife. It was a slaughter. Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he took in the sight. This wasn't hunting. This was something else. The bear let out a soft whine, and Jack turned to see it watching him, its eyes wide with fear and understanding. This was why the bear had come to him. It wasn't just about the traps. It was about survival, its own and that of every other creature in these woods. Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this had to be stopped, but the question now was, how? He was one man, unarmed except for a hunting knife, with a bear as his only ally. And whatever was going on here, it was bigger than he'd expected. The bear nudged him gently, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. It turned its head toward the cabin again, its growl low and steady, as if urging him to act. But Jack knew he had to be careful. Whoever had set those traps was still out there, watching, waiting. Jack took a deep breath. He didn't have much time. He needed a plan, and he needed one fast. Jack's heart pounded as he stood near the pile of carcasses, his stomach twisting with horror. This wasn't just hunting. It was a massacre. He hadn't seen anything like this in all his years living in the mountains. The animals hadn't been killed for food or sport. They were just left there. What could possibly drive someone to this? The bear growled softly behind him, and Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was no stranger to the cruelty of humanity, but this was something else. His thoughts raced as he crouched down, taking a closer look at the pile. Flies buzzed around the rotting corpses, and the stench was overwhelming. But Jack forced himself to focus. There had to be something here that could tell him more. Something that would explain why this was happening. He moved a few steps closer to the pile, careful not to disturb the scene. His eyes scanned the ground, looking for any clues. That's when he noticed something strange. Among the bones and fur, there were chains. Rusted, heavy chains, like the kind used to restrain large animals. They were tangled around the bodies, as if the animals had been trapped, dragged, and then left to rot. Jack's pulse quickened. Whoever was responsible for this wasn't just poaching animals. They were capturing them, restraining them, and then, what? Abandoning them? Using them for something darker? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He stood up, glancing back toward the cabin. The building sat silently, like a lurking predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack narrowed his eyes. Whatever was happening here, it had something to do with that place. He needed to get inside. The bear moved closer to him, its breath warm and steady in the cold air. Jack could sense its urgency, its need for him to understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about the bear, it was about everything in this forest. The traps, the slaughter, the hidden cabin. It was all connected. Taking a deep breath, Jack crouched low, moving quietly toward the cabin's entrance. The bear followed closely behind, its massive frame blending into the shadows of the trees. Jack's hands were steady, but his mind was racing. Whoever was behind this was dangerous, and he knew he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The closer he got to the cabin, the clearer the signs of human activity became. There were footprints in the dirt, cigarette butts scattered near the entrance, and more traps hidden beneath the brush. Jack clenched his fists. Someone had been here recently, and they weren't just hunting. They were setting up something much bigger. He reached the door of the cabin and paused, his heart hammering in his chest. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him inside. Jack hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder at the bear. The animal was watching him closely, its dark eyes filled with an unsettling mix of fear and trust. Jack swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The interior of the cabin was worse than he had imagined. The stench of decay hit him like a wall, and the dim light filtering through the dirty windows only made the scene more grotesque. The room was cluttered with makeshift cages, metal tables covered in bloodstains, and stacks of equipment that Jack couldn't begin to identify. Chains hung from the ceiling, their rusty links clinking softly in the breeze that blew through the cracks in the walls. Jack's stomach churned as he stepped further inside, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. But there was none. Whoever had been using this place had cleared out, or they were hiding. His gaze fell on a stack of papers strewn across one of the tables. He moved closer, careful not to touch anything, and scanned the documents. Maps of the forest, detailed notes on animal behavior, lists of dates and times. It was a detailed operation, one that had been going on for far longer than Jack had realized. But it wasn't just poaching. The notes mentioned experiments, tests, and something far more sinister than Jack had ever imagined. They were capturing the animals for a reason. Something to do with illegal wildlife trade, but also something experimental. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as he read through the documents. Whoever was running this operation wasn't just after animal pelts or meat. They were conducting tests on the wildlife, using them for some kind of twisted research. Suddenly, Jack heard a noise behind him, a soft creak, like the sound of someone stepping on an old floorboard. He froze, his heart racing. Slowly, he turned his head toward the door. Standing in the entrance was a man. Dressed in dirty overalls, his face obscured by the shadows, the man didn't move. He simply stood there, watching Jack with cold, calculating eyes. Jack's hand instinctively went to his hunting knife, his fingers tightening around the hilt. The bear growled lowly from outside, sensing the tension. For a long moment, neither Jack nor the man moved. The air between them was thick with tension, both of them calculating their next move. Jack's mind raced, trying to figure out how he could get out of this situation alive. Whoever this man was, he was dangerous, and Jack was standing in the middle of his operation. The man took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the dirt floor. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said enough. Jack knew that look. It was the look of someone who wasn't afraid to kill. Jack's pulse quickened, his instincts screaming at him to run. But where? The cabin was small, and the only way out was blocked by the man standing in the doorway. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to distract him, to get the upper hand before it was too late. Then, without warning, the bear let out a deafening roar. The man flinched, his attention momentarily diverted by the sound of the massive creature outside. That was all the time Jack needed. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light as he aimed for the man's arm. The man dodged, but Jack's blade grazed his skin, enough to make him stumble back. Jack didn't wait. He bolted for the door, his heart pounding as the bear moved to block the man's path. Together, man and bear fled into the forest. Jack's feet pounded against the forest floor as he sprinted through the undergrowth, the cold air stinging his lungs. Behind him, he could hear the bear crashing through the brush, its growls echoing through the trees. Jack didn't look back. He didn't have time. All he could think about was putting as much distance between him and the cabin as possible. The man who had blocked the doorway was still out there, and Jack had no doubt that he would come after them. The bear had bought him time, but Jack knew it wasn't enough. Whoever that man was, he wasn't working alone. There had to be others who were part of the operation Jack had uncovered. And if they caught him, Jack knew they wouldn't hesitate to kill him. He darted between the trees, his mind racing. The forest was dense, the canopy above blocking out much of the light. It was hard to see more than a few feet ahead, and the uneven ground made every step dangerous. But Jack had spent years navigating these woods. If there was one thing he knew how to do, it was how to disappear. The bear moved beside him, its massive frame surprisingly agile as it weaved through the trees. Jack had no idea why the animal was still following him, but he was grateful for its presence. In the chaos of the escape, they had become unlikely allies, both driven by a need to survive. A loud crack echoed through the forest, a gunshot. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The man was chasing them, and now he was armed. The sound of the shot reverberated off the trees, making it difficult to tell where it had come from, but Jack didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. He had to stay ahead of the man, stay hidden in the forest. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Jack ducked instinctively, feeling the bullet whiz past him and strike a tree nearby. His pulse raced. They were gaining on him. The bear let out a ferocious roar, its growl deep and resonant as it stopped in its tracks. Jack skidded to a halt, turning to see the bear standing protectively behind him, its teeth bared, eyes locked on something in the distance. Jack followed its gaze, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement in the shadows. The man from the cabin was closing in, his rifle raised and ready. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the man stepped out from behind a tree, his face twisted with anger. He wasn't alone. Behind him, two more men emerged, both armed and moving quickly. Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had no way to fight them, no way to defend himself. The bear was his only hope, but even then, he wasn't sure if they stood a chance against three armed men. The bear let out another deafening roar, taking a step forward as it squared off with the men. Jack could see the tension in the animal's posture, the way its muscles rippled beneath its fur. The bear wasn't going to back down, and neither was Jack. For a moment, the men hesitated. They hadn't expected to face a full-grown bear, and their fear was palpable. But it didn't last. The man in the lead shouted something to his companions, and they raised their rifles, aiming directly at the bear. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't let them kill the bear, not after everything the creature had done to protect him. Without thinking, Jack grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the man in the lead. The rock struck him in the shoulder, knocking him off balance just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, missing the bear by inches. The bear lunged forward, its massive paws slamming into the ground as it charged toward the men. Jack didn't wait to see what would happen next. He knew this was his only chance to escape. He turned and bolted, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the struggle, the bear roaring, the men shouting, and the crack of gunfire. Jack's heart raced as he pushed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. His lungs burned from the cold air, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The forest blurred around him as he ran. His mind focused solely on getting away from the danger that was closing in behind him. He didn't know how long he ran. Minutes, hours, it was impossible to tell. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. The sounds of the struggle behind him gradually faded, but Jack didn't dare slow down. His legs ached and his chest felt like it was on fire, but the fear kept him going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack stumbled to a stop, his body collapsing against the trunk of a tree. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself, his mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded. The forest around him was quiet now, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Jack looked around, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the men or the bear, but there was nothing. He was alone. For a moment, Jack allowed himself to catch his breath, his mind racing with everything that had happened. The bear, the cabin, the men with guns, it all felt surreal, like some kind of nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But it was real, and somewhere out there, the bear was still fighting for its life. Jack's hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. He had to make a decision. He could keep running, put as much distance between himself and the men as possible, or he could go back and try to help the bear, the creature that had saved him more than once already. Jack clenched his jaw, his mind made up. He couldn't leave the bear behind, not after everything it had done for him. Taking a deep breath, Jack stood up, his legs shaking from exhaustion. He turned back toward the direction he had come from, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't done yet. The forest loomed around Jack like a living creature, the shadows stretching and twisting as the daylight began to fade. His heart raced as he retraced his steps, each stride bringing him closer to the danger he had just fled from. His body screamed for rest, every muscle aching, but Jack pushed through the exhaustion. He couldn't leave the bear to face the armed men alone, not after everything they'd been through. His breath came in shallow gasps as he weaved between the trees, his senses on high alert. The sounds of the forest seemed louder now, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the snap of twigs, the distant rustle of wind through the branches. Every noise made Jack's heart jump, every shadow made him second-guess his decision to return. But he had to go back. He couldn't abandon the bear. The creature had saved his life, and now it was his turn to do the same. As Jack approached the area where the struggle had taken place, he slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape earlier was wearing thin, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. What if the men had already killed the bear? What if it was too late? He crouched low, moving silently through the underbrush until he reached a vantage point overlooking the clearing. His heart pounded in his chest as he peered through the trees, his breath catching in his throat. The bear was still there. The massive creature stood in the center of the clearing, its fur matted with dirt and blood. One of the men lay unconscious at its feet, while the other two were circling it cautiously, rifles raised. The tension in the air was palpable, the men clearly aware that they were outmatched by the sheer size and power of the bear, but unwilling to back down. Jack's pulse quickened. He couldn't just sit here and watch. The bear had saved him, and now he had to return the favor. His mind raced as he looked for something, anything that could give him an advantage. He spotted a thick branch lying on the ground nearby and quickly grabbed it, gripping it tightly in his hands. His plan was reckless, maybe even suicidal, but he didn't have time to think it through. He had to act. Taking a deep breath, Jack stood up and charged out of the underbrush, the branch raised above his head. The men spun around, their eyes widening in shock as Jack barreled toward them, yelling at the top of his lungs. The distraction worked. One of the men turned to face Jack, his rifle wavering as he tried to aim. But the bear seized the opportunity. With a deafening roar, it lunged at the nearest man, its massive paws slamming into his chest with enough force to knock him off his feet. The man screamed as he was thrown to the ground, his rifle skittering across the dirt. Jack didn't stop. He swung the branch with all his strength, striking the second man across the back. The blow sent him stumbling forward, his rifle falling from his hands as he tried to regain his balance. Jack raised the branch again, ready to strike, but before he could swing, the man turned and delivered a swift punch to Jack's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. Jack gasped for air, his vision blurring as he staggered backward. The man reached for his rifle, but the bear was faster. It charged at the man, knocking him to the ground with a force that made the earth tremble. Everything happened in a blur. Jack could barely process the chaos around him as he struggled to stay on his feet. The bear roared, the men screamed, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the forest. Then, suddenly, it was over. Jack blinked, his chest heaving as he looked around the clearing. The two men lay unconscious on the ground, their rifles discarded nearby. The bear stood over them, its dark eyes locked onto Jack, as if waiting for his next move. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with tension, both man and beast trying to understand what had just happened. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he met the bear's gaze, his body trembling from exhaustion. Then slowly, the bear stepped toward him. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the massive creature approached, its powerful frame looming over him. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away as possible, but something inside him kept him rooted in place. The bear had protected him. It had fought for him. And now, as it stood before him, Jack realized that their bond had deepened in a way he hadn't expected. The bear let out a soft grunt, lowering its head slightly as it looked up at Jack. There was no aggression in its eyes, only an understanding, a recognition that they were no longer just two creatures trying to survive. They were allies now. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry as he slowly reached out his hand. The bear didn't move, its dark eyes watching him intently. For a brief moment, Jack hesitated, his mind racing with the weight of what he was about to do. Then, gently, he placed his hand on the bear's head. The fur was coarse beneath his fingers, warm and surprisingly soft. Jack's heart pounded as he stood there, his hand resting on the head of the creature that had just saved his life. The bear let out a low, rumbling growl, but it wasn't a threat. It was almost content. Jack couldn't help but smile, a feeling of relief washing over him as the tension in his body melted away. Somehow, against all odds, they had made it through. Together. The forest around Jack and the bear felt eerily quiet after the chaos of the fight. The two men lay unconscious on the ground, their rifles discarded, and the tension that had hung in the air seemed to dissipate. But Jack knew better than to let his guard down. There was still one more man unaccounted for. The leader, the one who had blocked the doorway at the cabin. And Jack had no doubt that he was still out there, waiting for his moment to strike. Jack looked at the bear, its dark eyes scanning the trees with the same wariness he felt. They were both exhausted, bruised, and battered from the fight, but they weren't done yet. The leader wasn't the kind of man who would simply give up and walk away. He was dangerous, and he had something to protect. The illegal operation Jack had stumbled upon was bigger than he'd initially thought. It wasn't just about trapping animals. It was about something far more sinister, something that involved cruelty, profit, and the exploitation of the wildlife in this forest. Jack had uncovered a small part of it, but he knew there was more. And the man running the operation wasn't going to let Jack walk away with that knowledge. "We need to end this," Jack muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening around the hunting knife still sheathed at his belt. He glanced down at the unconscious men, then back toward the trees. The leader had to be nearby. He wouldn't have left his men to fight alone. As if on cue, a twig snapped in the distance, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. Jack's heart pounded as he spun around, his eyes scanning the dense foliage. The bear growled low, its massive body tensing as it sensed the approaching danger. Then, through the trees, the man appeared. He moved with a deadly calmness, his rifle slung across his back and a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jack recognized him immediately, the leader of the group, the man who had confronted him in the cabin. But there was something different about him now, something more calculated, more dangerous. His eyes gleamed with cold determination as he stepped into the clearing, his gaze locking onto Jack. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice dripping with malice. "I have to admit, you put up more of a fight than I expected, but you've made a mistake coming back here." Jack's jaw tightened, his muscles coiling with tension. He didn't respond, keeping his hand close to his knife as he watched the man approach. The bear stood beside him, its deep growl vibrating through the air. But the man didn't seem fazed. He was confident, too confident. He thought he had the upper hand. "You've seen too much," the man continued, circling slowly around Jack and the bear. "And I can't have that. This operation's worth a lot of money, more than you could ever imagine. And I'm not gonna let some nosy mountain man and his pet bear ruin it." Jack's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think clearly, had to find a way out of this without getting himself and the bear killed. The man's rifle was still strapped to his back, but Jack knew it wouldn't stay there for long. He was baiting him, trying to provoke Jack into making the first move. "I don't want trouble," Jack said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "But what you're doing here, it's wrong. These animals don't deserve this. No one does." The man's smile twisted into a sneer. "Don't give me that righteous crap. This is business, plain and simple. And in business, there are winners and losers. You, my friend, are about to lose." Before Jack could react, the man's hand darted to his rifle. In an instant, he had it raised, the barrel pointed directly at Jack's chest. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he dove to the side just as the gun fired, the deafening crack of the shot echoing through the clearing. The bullet missed Jack by inches, slamming into the tree behind him. He hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of him, but there was no time to recover. The man was already reloading, his eyes gleaming with cold calculation as he prepared to fire again. The bear let out a roar, charging toward the man with terrifying speed. The man's eyes widened, and for a split second, Jack saw fear flash across his face. But the man was quick, sidestepping the bear's attack and raising his rifle again. "No!" Jack shouted, scrambling to his feet. The bear lunged at the man, its massive paws swiping through the air, but the man was faster. He ducked under the bear's swing and fired another shot. The bullet grazed the bear's side, and the creature let out a pained roar, stumbling back. Jack's blood ran cold. The bear was hurt, and the man wasn't stopping. Jack's mind raced. He needed to do something, anything, to stop the man before he killed the bear. Without thinking, Jack grabbed the nearest rock and hurled it at the man with all his strength. The rock struck the man's arm, throwing off his aim just as he fired. The bullet went wide, missing the bear by inches. The man snarled in frustration, turning his attention to Jack. "You're a fool!" the man shouted, his voice filled with venom. "You think you can stop me? I've been running this operation for years, and no one's ever come close to shutting me down. You're just another problem to get rid of." Jack's heart pounded as the man raised his rifle once more, the barrel aimed directly at him. Time seemed to slow as Jack stared down the barrel, his mind racing with fear and desperation. But before the man could fire, the bear roared again, this time with a ferocity Jack hadn't heard before. The creature lunged at the man with renewed strength, its massive body colliding with him and knocking the rifle from his hands. The man hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him as the bear stood over him, growling menacingly. For a moment, Jack thought the bear would end it right then and there. But instead, the bear stepped back, its dark eyes locked onto the man as if daring him to try anything else. The man lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his face twisted with fear and rage. Jack stood over him, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the hatred in the man's eyes, the way he glared up at Jack and the bear with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "It's over," Jack said, his voice low and firm. "You're done." The man sneered, but he didn't move. He knew he had lost. The man lay on the ground, defeated, his breath ragged and shallow as he glared up at Jack and the bear. The anger in his eyes had faded, replaced by a dull realization that he had lost. Jack stood over him, his heart pounding as the adrenaline from the fight slowly drained away. His body ached, bruised from the escape and the struggle, but he didn't care. They had won. Against all odds, they had survived. The bear, its fur matted with dirt and blood, stood tall beside Jack, its dark eyes fixed on the man. The tension in the air had lifted, but the bear remained vigilant, its massive form a silent guardian. Jack glanced at the creature, a strange sense of gratitude welling up inside him. They had made it through this together, man and beast, an unlikely pair bound by survival. Jack knelt down beside the man, his eyes hard as he spoke. "You're going to jail for this. All of it, the traps, the animals, everything." The man coughed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You think anyone's going to believe you? Out here in the middle of nowhere? No one cares about a few dead animals." Jack's jaw clenched. He knew the man was wrong. What they had uncovered wasn't just a few dead animals. It was an illegal operation, one that stretched far beyond the traps hidden in the forest. The documents Jack had found in the cabin were proof. The maps, the lists, the records of transactions. They were all part of a bigger network, and Jack had every intention of bringing it down. "They'll believe me," Jack said firmly, "and they'll believe what I found in your cabin." The man's expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Jack could see it, the realization that his carefully guarded secret had been exposed, and there was no escaping the consequences. Before the man could respond, a low growl rumbled from the bear, reminding him of the presence of the powerful creature standing over him. Jack saw the fear return to the man's eyes, and this time, it wasn't just because of the danger he was in. It was because he knew his operation was finished. Jack stood up, stepping away from the man. He turned his gaze toward the forest, his thoughts already racing ahead to what would come next. He would go back to the cabin, gather the evidence, and contact the authorities. The operation would be shut down, and the men responsible for the cruelty in these woods would be held accountable. But for now, there was a more pressing matter. The bear. Jack looked at the creature beside him, its deep brown eyes watching him with an intensity that seemed almost human. There was a bond between them now, one forged in the heat of danger and the fight for survival. Jack had never felt anything like it before. He had always respected the wildlife in these mountains, but this was different. The bear wasn't just another animal, it was his ally, his protector. As the tension in the air eased, Jack approached the bear slowly, his hand outstretched. The bear didn't flinch, it simply watched him, its eyes calm and steady. Jack placed his hand on the bear's head, feeling the coarse fur beneath his fingers. There was a silent understanding between them now, a trust that had been earned through the trials they had faced together. "You saved my life," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The bear huffed softly, as if acknowledging Jack's gratitude before stepping back, its gaze shifting to the forest. Jack understood. The bear had survived, but it didn't belong to him. It belonged to the wild, to the untamed beauty of the mountains that had always been its home. Jack's heart tightened as he realized that this might be the last time he saw the bear. Their paths had crossed in a way neither of them could have predicted, but now it was time to part ways. The bear had done its part, and Jack had to do his. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, man and bear, each knowing what came next. Then, with a final glance at Jack, the bear turned and lumbered off into the trees, disappearing into the dense forest from which it had come. Jack watched it go, a bittersweet feeling settling in his chest. He would never forget this moment, the bond they had shared, the lessons he had learned about trust, survival, and the unbreakable connection between man and nature. With the bear gone, Jack turned his attention back to the men lying on the ground. He bound their wrists with rope he had found in the cabin earlier, making sure they wouldn't escape before he could contact the authorities. They would pay for what they had done, for the lives they had taken, and the cruelty they had inflicted on the animals of this forest. As Jack made his way back to the cabin to gather the evidence, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the trees. The forest, once a place of danger and darkness, now felt different, lighter somehow. Jack felt a sense of closure as he walked, knowing that the nightmare was finally over. When he reached the cabin, Jack took one last look around. The makeshift cages, the traps, the blood-stained tables, it was all part of a horror that would soon be exposed. But for now, Jack felt a quiet sense of victory. He had made it through. He had survived, and so had the bear. As he gathered the documents and prepared to leave, Jack allowed himself a moment to reflect. This journey had been more than just a fight for survival. It had been a test of his strength, his instincts, and his ability to trust in something beyond himself. And in the end, it had been the bear, the wild, untamed creature he had feared at first, that had taught him the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes, survival isn't about strength or strategy. Sometimes, it's about trust. Trust in nature, trust in the unknown, and trust in the bonds that are formed in the most unlikely of places. As Jack stepped out of the cabin for the final time, he felt the weight of the past few days lift from his shoulders. The forest, now bathed in the soft light of dusk, was quiet once again. But this time Jack knew it was a different kind of quiet, a peaceful quiet, one that came with the promise of new beginnings. He took a deep breath, smiled, and began the long walk home.